Welcome to OTT Talks, a series of conversations with think tankers, policymakers, and experts around the world. This episode is part of a series of discussions with European think tank leaders to reflect on the nature of their work in a changing Europe. My name is Enrique Mendizabal, and I am co-hosting this session with Goran Buldioski. Today, we have the honor of having Vessela Tcherneva with us. But first, Goran, why don't you set the scene for our discussion today?
Thank you, Enrique. We designed this series of conversations with leaders in think tanks in Europe with an aim to sort of look at the development of think tanks. Europe has been going through good 3 decades of various political and economic changes, and in that period has seen the emergence of quite a lot of think tanks, and as well increasing the role of the work that policy advice had from that sort of independent standpoint, not only from the ministries in the various government or the various institutions, European Union first and foremost. So in this series, we really hope to talk to people who have been for many years leading think tanks and see what have been the successes, what have been the challenges around their work, and as well to extract perhaps advice and lessons learned that will be applicable or useful to many colleagues engaged with think tanks across the world. Enrique, back to you.
Thank you, Goran. So after this introduction to the series, let me welcome our guest, Vessela Tcherneva. She's Deputy Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. She's an expert on EU foreign policy, the Western Balkans, and the Black Sea region. Vessela, you have been in and out of the think tank world. You were foreign policy advisor to the Bulgarian Prime Minister. Before that, you were spokesperson for the Bulgarian Minister of Foreign Affairs and a member of the Foreign Minister Political Cabinet. Previously, you were secretary of the International Commission on the Balkans. But what we are most interested in today, of course, is your work for the European Council on Foreign Relations and your experience in the think tank world in general. The European Council on Foreign Relations is one of the most prominent think tanks in Europe. It's a think tank that comprehensively covers the east and the west, the north and the south of Europe, with offices across the continent. So I am sure you'll have a lot to tell us about the changing nature of the European context and think tanks. But certainly your experience in government and regional policy bodies adds an important perspective to what I'm sure you'll have to say. Welcome, Vessela.
Thank you very much to both of you for having me.
Hi, Vessela. Great to have you on this podcast. Let me start a bit with a question around the context. And, working in Europe, I know that context probably will necessitate a separate podcast. So to start a bit on a lighter note, perhaps you can tell us, if you try to describe the context in which ECFR operates today with a movie, with a film, which one would it be?
Oh, well, I was actually thinking about our regional context because 30 years after the fall of the wall, it kind of seems that we're back to where we started, in the sense that democracy is not a given anymore. We are witnessing illiberal democracy or the liking of illiberal democracy in many of the countries in our region. And I think with the coming back of Trump, many of the leaders in the region would have, gotten the impression that their nationalist instincts are okay and are allowed. And while the strongest president in the world can claim, Canada or Greenland, why can we not claim bits and pieces of our neighbors? And so if we talk about this context in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, then I would probably mention this movie, Whose Is This Song? It's actually by a Bulgarian director. It's a documentary from a couple of decades ago. And the director's name is Adela Peeva. And the movie is about, or the documentary is about a song that exists in various ways across the Balkan region. It can be a wedding song, it can be a military march, it can be a funeral song, it can be a love song, and all of those versions of this one song, they kind of coexist. People don't know about the other versions, but also they are almost ready to, you know, start a fight, start a war over whose song that really is. And so I kind of feel we're in this very fragile moment when all of our kind of primitive instincts may resurface again.
Thank you, Vessel. We'll put a link in this podcast to the movie. I vividly remember that documentary where basically everybody in the region, I can say our region, given that we come from the same region, claiming the ownership of a song and as you said, ready to fight for it, while actually, interestingly enough, was a common heritage. I think that also depicts well the times where those instincts have resurfaced again. And I would say probably not only maybe they're stronger in Eastern or Southern Europe, but as well in the rest of Europe, where the European Union used to be the order of the day and union was there. That was also at the heart of the creation of the European Council on Foreign Relations. It was more about unification rather than analyzing those tendencies to tear the continent apart. But thank you for invoking this documentary, and we'll put a link. Kike?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really enjoying this series because I'm learning about you know, films and books that I have to add to my list, but also because every time I hear a description of the context of society in the Western Balkans, I think of Latin America. I think there's so many similarities between our cultures, and magical realism seems to be a shared experience for sure. I can imagine many of our countries going to war for a spirit or a food or a dish or something like that. Um, but this is also interesting because, as you say, Goran, we have, you know, there's a common heritage, common some history in most of Europe. At the same time, is made up of many different sort of polities, you know, quite small next to each other with also a very long history. And I've been observing European think tanks for a long time. I think about almost 20 years now. I'm living in Barcelona now, but I used to live in London for a long time, and that's where I got started in this work. And just as I've seen, you know, politics change dramatically across Europe, I think I've also seen the think tank scene how, you know, adapt and evolve and change, and realize that there are many think tank experiences in the region. Can you, Vessela, can you maybe reflect on what do you think have been the major shifts in the role of think tanks over the past decade or two in Europe?
Coming back maybe a little bit also to Goran's first question, the context in Europe has been changing for the last 2 decades quite significantly. The late 90s, the early 2000s were times of great optimism, of hope that Europe can be, so to say, the model, the trendsetter for the rest of the world, where nations can share sovereignty in kind of supranational bodies and can rely on international law and on the principles of democracy and human rights to build prosperous and democratic societies, but also in relation to each other, to kind of embark on a real win-win type of relationship type of setup. I think now, 20 years later, we still have a great deal of interdependence. We have the EU actually grown and it has taken more responsibilities. But at the same time, there is a lot of pushback. There is a lot of global rivalry, and many of the problems of the early 90s seem to be coming back, especially things like nationalism, kind of anti-liberalism, but also this trend of we may call it populism, but actually it's much more about nurturing fears in societies and riding on that wave. And so while think tanks 20 years ago were there basically to support this, I would say, kind of post-nationalist, postmodern even maybe, journey. Right now, think tanks have to find ways of reframing issues so that they can be palatable to societies ridden by fear. And especially when we talk about Europe and European foreign policy, and the European Council on Foreign Relations is about European foreign policy, we have really shifted quite heavily exactly in the direction of giving politicians arguments why still searching for European solutions is better, is more effective, is kind of a good investment of political capital. And I would say this is not easy, but at the same time, we actually face more demand. And this is also one of the big lessons for ECFR that, and I believe for other think tanks as well, when governments, when political leaders search for answers, this is usually in times of crisis. So for us, it means that we have to be extremely agile and we have to be able to, foresee the next crisis in order to be useful. This is a very, very interesting, but also a difficult task.
So is this so whereas before there was a bit of a consensus and you were working with the wave, and to some extent you're now somewhat more reactive? Do you think think tanks are dealing with crises, trying to understand what is going on, to explain this sort of breaking up of the consensus? And that means new skills have to be brought into the think tanks. You alluded to looking into the future and predicting the next crisis or explaining the next crisis to policymakers. That's really interesting. Is that something you observe also with your peers? So peer think tanks, others that you might work with, engage with. Do they also perceive a shift in the functions that they have to fulfill?
I, I would not want to speak on behalf of others, but I would say it's a it's a it's a paramount task for a think tank to um, to make this shift and to be really on the front foot in times of crisis, rather than stick to our instincts and basically try to maintain the status quo.
Yeah.
And I think because people in general don't like change, right? And it is stressful. People, especially when you don't know, when you don't have the hope like we had in the 90s that things are only going to get better, right? It was the end of history time. So now that we don't know how this movie is going to end, it is much more difficult to find the right tone, but also to find the right motivation, but also to simply be able to say, it's okay to be disruptive, because only through disruption, sometimes you can leave the old habits behind and the old instincts behind, and really facing a new era, facing a new spirit of the time, is a means that one has to be really equipped with new ideas, but also with new skills. And especially for traditional institutions, this is not easy at all. And on top of that, you also have questions about your audience, right? Because for think tanks, especially those of us who work on European issues, we have to deal with a growing portion of Eurosceptics in our domestic politics, in the European Parliament, in parts of the European institutions. And so how can we be useful for the kind of goal of creating a coherent European foreign policy, and at the same time reach out to them and try to incorporate them in this discussion, or at least to involve them in a meaningful way. You can ask the question about about red lines and so on. So it is actually a much more complex environment, and I think the path that we think tanks have to choose every day is actually much more complicated.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up question. You talked about greater demand. I assume this is greater demand from policymakers
Yes.
and decision makers.
Yes.
Is that being translated in, say, greater funding to think tanks in the space in which you are working? Because we're seeing at the same time that in parts of maybe the Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, funding certainly from the West is reducing, is coming down, is harder to get. But at the European level, do you see the opposite happening then?
I think every time when there is a crisis, and there are certain topics people really want to fight for, want to continue working on, there is additional resource that can be found. For instance, you remember when the whole green agenda started, maybe some 8 years ago as a big kind of push across various member states and societies. There was a lot of funding for this agenda, but also when there is a crisis of this agenda, and now we see a lot of pushback against the green agenda, I believe there will be again an additional, I would say, push in terms of also in terms of resources, just because people want to keep this topic alive and they want to keep it on high on the agenda. So I would say there are high points and low points for policies as we go forward, and depending on how sustainable and how robust we want to make them, the funding for them should also be sustainable. And I believe that clearly the idea of common European policies, especially in the realm of foreign and security policy, is one of those topics.
Right.
Thanks, Vessela. You mentioned many different things. Let me pick up my favorite on disruption. And you said, like, how we can be disruptors and not disrupted. I think probably this could make another movie on Europe of the last couple of decades. But going back to ECFR, I remember the times when you were created, one mini disruption you did was not to open an office in Brussels at the time. And we're talking 2007, 2008, where this was like unthinkable. I personally consider that as a success, a thing that you did well. But what are the other things when you look back now, the CFR, when you say, oh, wow, we really did this well and we did a good job? What do you think that the ECFR did well as a think tank, and what will be its successes when you look back?
I would not want us to look too far back because, again, I believe we're in a sort of at the beginning of a new cycle, of a new era of international relations. And I would probably think back only a couple of years ago, maybe let's say 3-4 years ago, when we started discussing the possibility of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. My colleague Gustav Gressel at the time was probably one of the very few voices warning and depicting the Russian military plans, the Russian military buildup, explaining why it matters. So this was one, I think, big warning sign, of course, for those who wanted to hear it, because this is the problem with us think tanks. We can try to help, but only but only where we're welcome. And so I think on Russia, this has been definitely, we have been an outlier, and late on the war in Ukraine, we were one of the voices that were kind of trying to help European policymakers think through why the support for Ukraine at the very beginning needed to be bold so that we don't have this protracted war, which we unfortunately ended up with. So in terms of our intellectual prudence, I think we were successful. In terms of our impact, less so, but European politics is ever more complicated. The other example maybe I would give is now with the ascendance of Trump, and we have a couple of colleagues who have been working on this topic, writing scenarios about what Trump's policies on the various fronts would be. This has been something that European policymakers were very eager to learn. It is true that we did not predict that Trump would want to take Greenland or Canada, but
Nobody did. Yeah, exactly.
No, nobody did. But his way of thinking, I think, we succeeded to transmit. And last but not least, we have been doing for the last several years now a series of public opinion polls on foreign policy, because we think that not only is it more and more the case that foreign policy is done in the member states rather than in Brussels, which is why we didn't open an office in Brussels in 2007. But we now see even a deeper connection between domestic politics and foreign policy, and between public attitudes and foreign policy making. And I believe our polling has helped shape some of the decisions, of the big foreign policy decisions in Europe, and is continuing to inform policymakers. So if you ask me whether there is a clear-cut win, a clear-cut victory that we can claim, I would say, you know, there are moments where we have been useful, but ultimately the responsibility for political decisions lies with policymakers.
With the policymakers, and you've been advisor, you've been in ministries, you know how that goes. I like to say often that with the think tanks, one should measure the relevance. And I think ECFR has been relevant for all these conversations and many more that you mentioned, Vessela. I personally don't like the talk, and being a former donor myself, donors are probably guilty of the talk of the impact and expecting sometimes the unrealistic, that the think tanks are those who actually can claim the impact on, decisions. I would rather stick to the relevance, and this is where actually the relevance of the institution and ECFR has been relevant and very often in the center of a lot of discussions on foreign policy. If we look at the other side of the coin, what would you have done differently? Is there anything either with the management of the think tank or with its own development or in terms of policy developments, products? Is there anything that if you have a magic wand to turn back time, you would sort of wish to have done things differently?
I believe that 2014, with the first Russian invasion in Ukraine, we kind of went back to business as usual very quickly. So did policymakers, by the way, but so did think tanks as well. And I think in the meantime, there has been a lot of talk and writing about, buffer states, about the kind of buffer belt around Europe. We should have known better. We should have known that buffers never really remain buffers. I mean, they always get filled with the power which is more aggressive. So I believe I'm not sure whether we would have changed much on the course of history, and this is a question that is always very speculative. But I think we should have probably paid more attention to kind of the next possible scenarios.
I guess as you said before, nobody likes change, and so we like to convince ourselves that maybe we can keep going, a bit
The
longer.
same way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for the same way. And then if everybody else does it, then things sort of settle down a little bit until maybe it's too late. Um, do you mind, Goran, if I take on the next question, which sort of leads me into talking about funding, because of course a lot of these decisions, a lot of the choices that think tanks can make are affected by the funding available to them, right? And you said before that in a time of crisis, there is interest to fund the work of think tanks like yours. So I've got a couple of quick questions to ask. One is, who are those interested in funding um, uh, your think tank and think tank like yours? Is it ministries, governments, European Commission, foundations, etc.? But maybe crucially, who is interested in funding the opposite agenda, right? Who's interested in funding the crisis think tanks, or think tanks that are maybe um, driving Europe in sort of the opposite direction that you might be interested in driving Europe through your research and policy advice?
So think tanks like ours are funded mainly by foundations, and they can be both public and private foundations. That can be also private individuals, companies, and governments, of course. Governments, however, have fairly limited funding. It's usually project-driven, project-bound, and these days, I believe for foundations, it should be fairly easy to make the case why they need to fund think tanks like ours, because there is a clear public interest. I mean, there is no need to explain why there is a crisis of European foreign policy making. So, that's that. But if I can maybe make a step back and compare it to 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you had also a lot of, or a lot more, let's put it this way, American foundations, American funding, government funding, especially here in our region in Central and Eastern Europe. There was a lot of USAID money, and with the membership in the EU, all of that money basically went away, meaning that the big American donors would say we don't need to fund think tanks and civil society in this new democracies, because now they're members of the EU. The EU is going to take care of this. The truth is that the EU does not fund think tanks, or rarely funds think tanks. The EU gives money to governments, and these are the cohesion funds, the agricultural funds, and so on and so forth. And then the governments decide how to disperse this money, and whether their funds go into think tanks, sometimes, but not very often. There are other ways how they decide to spend this money. And so, in a paradoxical way, basically the EU membership made it more difficult for think tanks and civil society, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. And here in brackets, I would ask, looking at the result of this policy, given that in all of our countries you have now incoming illiberal or already there illiberal governments, maybe there is a connection. And I close the bracket. So what I'm trying to say is that being an independent think tank basically means you really have to state your independence first and then see how you fund your work. Otherwise, you become really a client. And I think a credible think tank should really stay away from becoming a client as a fatal risk.
If you started with your agenda and then looked for the funding, what would be your ideal income statement, right? You know, what kind of funders do you think would be, you know, would be your dream come true in the future?
I think there should be the ideal funding should be from foundations, be they public or private, foundations who share our goals and our views of the world, more or less, or foundations who at least have the same outcome in mind. I'm saying this because you asked me how the opposite side is funded, and I did not answer that. But the opposite side can be funded, of course, by third parties. Obviously, the Russians are very active there. But you also have, you know, funders who aim at destroying or destabilizing the current order, or let's say the order that we know from the end of the Cold War. And these are not necessarily only, you know, people in Moscow. This can be also disruptors in the US, and we have seen this that some of the far right parties in Europe have gotten not only Russian funding but also American funding. We live in a world where not everything is as it seems, and so I believe the ideal funder would be somebody who really wants us to work on our ideas rather than treating us as a client who can deliver a certain message or shape an opinion in a certain way. I think this is the biggest threat.
Vessel, I can't agree more, but I would say probably these days some think tanks or some countries do not need Trump or Russian influence. If I look at the you know, the richest think tank in Europe at the moment is Matthias Corvinus Collegium that has been endowed by the Hungarian state. I mean, it's much more than a think tank, university and whatnot, but you know, who from other European think tanks could say that they have more than €1 billion on their account, and that's what they have in assets essentially. But also it begs the question of whether the sort of the right leaning or the radical right political spectrum was more eager to put the money where the mouth is. Now, speaking of that, obviously, what you place as the biggest risk for the think tanks, this is not the risk for those think tanks because they're exactly in that client position. That's actually their entire mission. They're not debating about the independence. They are serving a particular agenda, and they look like the think tanks. On the other hand, have the more progressive, pro-democracy politicians could have put more money when they were in power or when they had good budgets? Probably yes. And I think that's probably a good point, not only to think about the past, but also to think about the future. Because you could be truthful to the independence of think tanks while and allowing them to do things and also tell you unpleasant truths as we would like them to do, but by the same token let a significant amount of money. And I think you're absolutely right. When I think on our region of Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, in so many ways, actually, you could say that Norwegian money has been more important to independent, critical civil society than EU money. And that's a pretty saddening conclusion. But we'll come to this, and I think this is also important to talk not only about ECFR, not only about your own think tank, but in general as one of the policies that that needs to be not only rethought, but money to be reallocated.
Thank you, Goran. So it's time for a break, but when we return, we will explore the strategic choices that Vessela and her colleagues have had to make to adapt to this changing context and the need to prepare for the future. And we're back after a short break. Thank you for joining us. So, Vessela, let me ask you a question, a practical question. Leading a think tank for over a decade must come with many stories of successes and challenges. Can you reflect on some of the key decisions that you've had to make to ensure that your think tank's relevance and impact is being sustained over the years?
Running a think tank which is growing, because we have been growing for the last more than a decade and a half, actually quite exponentially. We were, a dozen people when I started, and we're more than 100 now. And this is a type of growth that has both opportunities and risks in it. And while the growth has allowed us to expand our expertise, to have all these various geographical programs, but also to have to do horizontal work on Europe's foreign policy toolbox, on defense, on AI, on geoeconomics, all of that risks turning the think tank into, if I can put it, a research institute. Because when you grow, you have to make the system work, in a professional manner, rather than being the startup of 10 or 12 people. And so keeping the spirit of ECFR, having this idea that we all pull in the right direction, yet at the same time nurturing brilliance is a bit of a challenge. And I believe the biggest, the turning moment for me was when I realized that it was not about having an outside professional to manage the organization, because we went through this phase for a very short time. but it was actually about having people from within, empowering them to do some of the management tasks, knowing the business model, knowing the spirit of ECFR. And ever since, this has really paid off. And every time I have to make the choice, you know, whether to kind of streamline processes or to go for some sort of an internal deliberation on how to fix the problem, I always go for the latter, because I really believe that we have the best solutions within ourselves. It's really about getting them out, or making them, allowing them to surface in the right way. And so this, of course, requires maybe a bit more effort, but I really believe this has what has kept us as an organization in a good shape, because we also we kind of can rely on each other as a team or a number of teams, but we can also be creative and disruptive when need be.
That's
This is a
interesting.
bit, you know, like oil and water. So mixing them every time is a bit of a challenge.
But that's an interesting reflection around the growth and the challenge of becoming a research center rather than a think tank. So the idea that a think tank has sort of the same spirit of a startup, disruptive, young, agile, whereas a research center is something much more established, much more slower, takes its time, deals maybe with the long-termness of change rather than the emergent risks and opportunities.
Exactly.
I think it's just reflection, but also makes me think of the fact that the challenges are maybe are they more complex, larger, and therefore require maybe larger investments, longer term investments, multiple skills, disciplines, resources thrown at them, which might be much harder for a small think tank to handle. They're multidimensional, right? So it's not just about economics or health or education or migration. It's a
Right.
combination of all of those. So if you want to tell a complete story, you need to be able to draw from these different sectors and disciplines, and maybe a larger think tank is able to do that.
Exactly, and I think this is the value added for think tanks in many cases. Just working across silos and having, you know, the China experts working hand in hand with our let's say green tech people and with those who work on trade. So in order to describe the dependency or the ways out of the dependency on China in the green transition. And this is something that, let's say, ministries don't have this agility. So they would have a desk officer on China and maybe a climate envoy, but they would not have the infrastructure in between. So making this happen, making this work also in a think tank is it makes our work very interesting, but it's also not it was not always easy, let's put it this way.
Yeah.
At the beginning it was a bit of a push to make colleagues understand that working across programs actually creates something better.
Vessel, we spoke a lot about the ECFR, about the context, a lot of your strategic decisions, choices, successes. What about yourself? What has been the impact on you as an individual? What have been the things that you really liked to do? What have been things that you didn't like to do? How has this work impacted you as an individual? As well, mentioning that you've been in and out of the think tank, you've been in ministry advising, but then back to the think tank. What has been the impact of ECFR on you as an individual?
I think I'm extremely lucky to have had this career so far because I started as a diplomat. I went to think tanking after the first 6 years in the MFA. Then I went back as a political appointee. Then I returned to ECFR and so on. Altogether 3 times. It is quite unusual for I think for most European ministries and career diplomats to have this opportunity to go in and out of government and in and out of think tanks. This is indeed a very interesting way of shaping policies or helping shape policies without really having to be part of a political setup, let's say, that I would have to strongly disagree with. If I had remained in the administration, I would have had disagreements more than once, very, very strong disagreements. But also think tanking gives you the freedom to engage intellectually much more than one can afford while in government. It was really only on weekends when I could read what my fellow think tankers would write when I was the foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister, for instance. I mean, it was a real luxury to do that. So all in all, I envy myself a little bit.
That's good to hear. That's also like an advertisement for people who are considering a think tank career. Any regrets, Vessela, or anything that you would have done differently, or has impacted you, let's say, negatively, and you would like to change that?
I don't have any regrets, no. I believe that professionally I have been honest both with vis-a-vis my colleagues and vis-a-vis the topics that I work on. In think tanking, you also have the possibility to work with a lot of really amazing people and amazing brains. And I think this is one of the big virtues of this environment. So no regrets whatsoever.
Thank you. I'm tempted to go with the next question. So on this, what will be, we expect that a lot of people who are in the think tank business and or those supporting will listen to this podcast, and we want to have an advice for them. So what will be, building on what you just said about your own career, about ECFR, what will be your advice to future to people who engage in think tanks, also to other fellow think tank directors? What will be the advices to them as they probably navigate the equally testing waters of today's politics? It's not only Europe, it's not only Eastern Europe, Western Balkans, where it's pretty difficult and challenging to do this work.
Yeah, you asked me if I had regrets, but you didn't ask me whether I had fears for the future. And frankly, I'm more worried than I have been ever before, I think, about how, the world is going to look like for our children. This is a time when all of our kind of beliefs that were shaped by the 90s, by the reunification of Europe, by the return of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, all of them are now under pressure, and it is going to be, I think, growingly difficult to build governments and societies which adhere to, those values. So we have to face a world which is much more chaotic on the outside, much more unpredictable, and we will have to stick together on the inside. And I think think tanks are key in that effort. So for those who will engage with think tanks in the future, I would say the task of think tanks is going to be probably more important than it has been in the last 30 years. So yeah, be serious about supporting think tanks or working for think tanks.
That's very inspiring. Vessela, thank you very much. This has been fantastic. I have learned so much as with all these interviews. The series continues with think tank leaders from across South and East of Europe and Europe in general. And you can find the episodes whenever you listen to your podcast or by visiting the OTT website on thinktanks.org. From Goran and me, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vessela. Thank you, Kiki.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.